Good afternoon, everyone. My name is BASSAM HADDAD, and I am joined by my co-host MOUIN RABBANI for this conversation. And we are delighted to have again with us Mokhiber, whom I'll introduce in just a minute. This is part of the Gaza Conversations podcast or program on Palestine and Context.org. And the project that runs all these conversations is the Gaza and Context Project, which is a collaboration of more than 24 university and research centers worldwide. And you can find everything on PalestineandContext.org, and it's on your screen. This conversation is on the Sarajevo Declaration of the Gaza Tribunal. And we have with us a steering committee member and one of the drafters, Mokhiber. I'll say a couple words about Craig, and I'll be a little short because his bio is quite long, and you can find it on Jadaliyya.com.
And Mokhiber is an...
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe people know the first couple of lines by heart right now. Mokhiber is an international human rights lawyer and former senior United Nations official. He left the UN in October 2023, penning a widely read letter that warned of genocide in Gaza, criticized the international response, and called for a new approach to Palestine and Israel based on equality, human rights, and international law. He has spent 4 decades in the international human rights movement, including more than 30 years at the United Nations. You can find the rest of his bio on Jadaliyya.com, but for now, let me just welcome him. Ahlan wa sahlan, Craig. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you, Bassam. Nice to be with you and MOUIN.
MOUIN, كيفك?
Very good to be with both of you again.
Good to see you all. We were speaking before we started the live about what is the value of us talking about this and saying almost the same things for now almost 20 months, but there's no alternative at the same time that the killing has not stopped. So we are continuing with our conversations. Craig, something really important happened a couple of days ago, which is the Sarajevo Declaration of the Gaza Tribunal. Can you give us an introduction as to what is the Gaza Tribunal and if you can place it within other similar efforts to start with?
Sure. Well, I think a lot of Jadaliyya viewers will be familiar with the idea of the Russell Tribunal. This was a people's tribunal in 1966 set up by Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher and public intellectual, with other prominent thinkers at the time, to address U.S. aggression and atrocities in Vietnam at that time. And that model has been reproduced several times in history to address other moral outrages. And this tribunal, the Gaza Tribunal, was set up on that model essentially as a kind of organized reaction to the lawlessness and brutality of Israel and other powerful actors, the US, the UK, Germany, and all of their collaborators. Kind of a moral reaction to the failure of the world to mobilize an effective response to this violent depravity that we've been witnessing over the course of the last 19 months plus. And the idea is to try to mobilize the power of decent society to counter the abusive state power that we've been witnessing. So the Gaza Tribunal bases itself on this idea of a people's tribunal, a Russell's tradition. It was launched in November. We had our first meeting in London in February, and then we just finished this week almost a week of public meetings in Sarajevo. I should say that this particular Gaza Tribunal was initiated by Professor Richard Falk, who I think also a lot of your viewers will be familiar with as well. He's a prominent public intellectual, probably the preeminent professor of public international law in the U.S. He's now president of the tribunal.
And also a former UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories.
Exactly right. Former Special Rapporteur, served as a UN expert, has been a very visible voice for justice, and very significantly so on questions relating to Palestine. So people like Richard Falk and others, thinkers and activists from Palestine, from around the globe as well, all came together to form this tribunal, not only to address the genocide and the colonial horrors that Israel is perpetrating in Palestine, but also to look at the complicity of powerful states and corporations and media companies and these Israel proxy groups in the West, all of those who are engaged in this historic horror, and the inaction, or at least the inadequate response of most countries and institutions in the world, whether at the national or the international level. How can it be that all of these months later, we are still witnessing this live stream genocide, this horror about which all are aware, and yet no one seems to be able to mobilize an adequate response? So what we've been doing in the tribunal is considering survivor testimonies, expert witnesses, the analysis of our own members, and ultimately the plan in the coming months is to convene a jury of conscience of prominent folks to pronounce later this year. But that hasn't stopped us from working already, collecting evidence and information, building an archive of evidence, testimony, and our own analysis, all based on this basic premise that no official institution, no state, no group of states is coming to rescue Palestine or to build a more moral international order. And that means that the task falls to all of us, right? To civil society, to social movements, to people of conscience, and that we need to mobilize the untapped power of the people in their millions, as we know, just from the demonstrations that have been taking place and the dissent that's been expressed over the course of the last 19 months, to also come up with ideas on isolating the Israeli regime in the ways that South Africa was isolated, building on boycott, divestment, sanctions, other such measures, and to make sure that we are all on record actively dissenting to the complicity of our own governments and our own institutions, whatever they may be, in the perpetration of this historic horror, basically to try to counter the forces of evil with untapped forces of justice that we know are there to help to bring more pressure to bear in every sector, because the pressure to do the wrong thing is enormous and is prevailing at the moment. That means we have a special duty to try to bring pressure to bear in the other direction, to say that genocide will not be normalized, that apartheid will not be normalized, that settler colonialism will not be normalized anymore, and as the declaration says, that Palestine will be free. It is a cry of conscience, the declaration that was adopted. I should say that's an idea of what the tribunal is. I should say what the tribunal is not, because there's always a confusion around these things. The tribunal includes some of the most skilled international lawyers on the planet, literally. So I mentioned Richard Falk, but lots of other really brilliant lawyers. But the tribunal is not a formal judicial or legal mechanism, right? It's an assembly of civil society, of movements, of thinkers and activists, people of conscience, as I said, who are determined to end what is happening in Palestine. And we operate differently from those formal institutions. For example, we reject the idea that we have to wait for a final pronouncement by a court, whether it's the ICJ or the ICC or any other court, years down the road, because we see that as fundamentally immoral in the face of a moral exigency like genocide, right? This is not something we can all fold our hands and wait for a declaration by a court. And unlike a court, we begin with the recognition of the reality of genocide. It is a genocide. There is no doubt among reasonable people anymore about that. So we begin, we don't have to deliberate to reach a conclusion of genocide. We begin with a recognition of the genocide, of the apartheid, of the settler colonialism, because we see these as undeniable realities, right? And with this very urgent moral imperative of confronting these crimes now with all the power and resolve that can be mobilized in society. Because while you have the official institutions just endlessly debating whether it's genocide, whether you should use the apartheid and so on, endlessly debating whether the night has fallen, while the people in Palestine are living in the darkness. And the rest of us are not doing enough to try to find a way to bring back the light. So no, international institutions, governments are not coming to save us. And so we need to do it ourselves. The other thing that came up very much during this meeting of the tribunal, we don't engage in the kind of moral prevarication that's so common among governments and official institutions. Even I have to say at the UN, we don't play the both sides game in a situation where the two sides are colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, oppressor and oppressed, genocidaire and victims. That very cowardly approach of not taking sides in a genocide is something that we explicitly reject, and our work proceeds on that basis. We also refuse to recognize this Israel exception to international law that has dominated for the past 77 years, invented by and reinforced by Western state power by the Brits and the Americans and others. For us, either the law is real and it applies to everybody equally, or it's a lie, a perfidious weapon of oppression and subjugation in the hands of state power. So we reject that, and we insist on the equal application of the law. We reject the gag orders that are imposed by Western powers and a lot of international institutions that have the effect of shoring up Israeli impunity, which is the central problem. So we speak openly in the tribunal about root causes. We're using words that states and official institutions refuse to utter, and we're using them whether they like it or not. We are challenging Zionism, settler colonialism, ethno-supremacism, apartheid, the G word, genocide. We don't sidestep these because we know these are actually the root of the problem, and that you cannot solve a problem without attention to root causes, which is why all of this nonsense of Oslo and other things have failed, because they have avoided looking at the real root causes of the problem. We don't. We have there's a conference coming up at the UN, as you know, on Palestine in June. A real risk that conference will be focused on trying to revive the stinking corpse of Oslo, right? Or again, talking about establishing Palestinian Bantustans, the promise of a two-state solution somewhere down the road, while the genocide continues to burn. And we don't take those. We reject those approaches outright. We speak the truth out loud. We have the audacity to demand justice, right? Not just to accept whatever crumbs might come out of some political process. So for us, I'm sorry, I'm making a speech here, I just realized. The Sarajevo Declaration is a kind of an antidote to the moral obfuscation, the distorted narratives, the complicity that's dominated the official positions of institutions and states for the last 19 months, the last 77 years, actually. And the first product is this Sarajevo Declaration that was adopted.
So on that declaration, you've just concluded, I think, a 3-day public meeting in Sarajevo, and that resulted in the Sarajevo Declaration. Could you tell us a little bit about the meeting, and also what the main takeaways from the declaration are?
I have to say the meeting was really very inspiring. I mean, what do you think happens when you gather prominent thinkers from Palestine, from across the globe, and you have them confront an issue like Palestine? And these are decent people who care about human rights, who are not constrained by diplomatic protocol. They're not shackled by the biases of the West. They're not interested in the orthodoxies of the U.S. empire, right? Or the parameters that are allowed by corporate media. They're speaking the truth. They're looking at the problem as it is and how it needs to be addressed. And you ask them, consider the imperatives of justice and speak the truth. That's where the declaration came from. This meeting with hearings and witness testimonies and analysis and expert witnesses and so on, all of which is available on YouTube. I think it's Gaza Tribunal on YouTube, to just to address.
So it was all recorded and is available for public viewing.
It is on. It's all on. All the sessions are available for public viewing, including some of these powerful testimonies that were read that were terrifying and heartbreaking on experiences on the ground in Palestine, and all of that was. In this first instance, was fed into this appeal to conscience that is the declaration, the Sarajevo Declaration, which we hope can also be a kind of platform for collective action that people can organize on. That was the main product that was declared. Then we can talk, if you like, about what's in it, but that's the idea.
Yeah, please do.
Well, I mean, some of it's obvious, right? It declares the collective moral outrage at Israel's genocide, at the many other crimes. It declares unwavering solidarity with the people of Palestine, commitment to working in solidarity with partners across the globe, an insistence on accountability for perpetrators and redress for victims, the end goal of a free Palestine, nothing less than that. It is, I think, a very important piece here is that it displays real moral consistency in opposing bigotry. So it says, that we're absolutely committed to the struggle against all forms of racism and discrimination and bigotry. And we say that necessarily includes fighting against Islamophobia, anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Semitism, apartheid, settler colonialism, but also against Zionism. And the declaration identifies what it calls the destructive ideology of Zionism as the official state ideology of the Israeli regime. And pledges, a struggle against this very destructive ideology, and it offers an alternative vision. It says, it begins with this quote from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." And then it says there is no exception to this rule, including for Palestinians, and that means that we have to work toward decolonization from the river to the sea, an end to the ethno-supremacist order, and replacing Zionism with another dispensation founded on equal human rights for Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others. It also takes on the international system in the declaration for its failures. It expresses a very serious concern on the direction of the international order, of international politics, international relations, international institutions for their failings, but also recognizes what happens when those international institutions are stepping up to defend the rights of the Palestinian people, the attacks from the US and others, the Israelis and others on those institutions. It sets forth its idea on what needs to be done to end Israeli impunity and to hold Israel to account. So it emphasizes this idea of isolation of the Israeli regime, its containment, boycott, divestment, sanctions, military embargo, suspension from international organizations. How can it be that all this time later, as Israel literally attacks the UN, kidnaps, tortures, murders its staff in record numbers, destroys its facilities, blocks its aid, obstructs its operations, Israel still has UN credentials and is walking free in the corridors of the UN in Turtle Bay in New York. So it demands their suspension, prosecution, including criminal prosecution of its perpetrators. It stands in solidarity with those who are suffering this wave of persecution and crackdowns on human rights defenders standing up for Palestine all around the world, especially in the West. And it explicitly goes after this tactic used by Israel and its proxies of smearing as anti-Semites or supporters of terrorism anyone who speaks out against Israeli atrocities or stands up for Palestinian human rights. Again, unapologetically honors the courageous resistance of the Palestinian people, the movement of millions of people around the world at risk for standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. It recognizes the right of the Palestinian people to armed resistance in accordance with international law, which you're not going to see out of a declaration coming out of other institutions at this moment. It recognizes as axiomatic the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, that this is not something they have to negotiate for. It just is, as a matter of international law and of morality. It places Palestinian agency and Palestinian leadership up front, that is to be respected in all cases on decisions affecting their lives or the movement for of their rights. It takes on the question of the institutions, what they're doing. The International Court of Justice, which has taken up the genocide case, issued landmark advisory opinions that should be a roadmap for a more lawful approach to Palestine. South Africa for having the courage to bring the genocide case to the ICJ. We call for expediting the criminal case in the International Criminal Court against Israeli perpetrators, and for states to meet their obligations, and for the U.S. to cease its obstruction of justice there, including its sanctions. And we recognize, that internationally there are some very positive actors, the special procedures of the UN Human Rights Council, like Francesca Albanese and a dozen others, who have been consistently maintained a strong and principled voice in holding Israel to account and have been attacked for it. So we know the whole system isn't broken. That piece of the system is working as it's supposed to be, but it's not being defended the way it needs to be defended. And of course, the humanitarian actors who have been absolutely heroic in assisting the people of Palestine during this genocide. Foremost among them, we say explicitly, UNRWA, and we defend UNRWA and demand accountability for attacks on them. I'm not going to read everything in the declaration, but let me just read one quote where it ends. It gives you a sense of what we think this thing is for. Because the final words of the declaration warn that the world is approaching a dangerous precipice, the front edge of which is in Palestine, it says, and that both key international organizations and most countries of the world have failed in defending the human rights of the Palestinian people and in responding to the Israeli regime's genocide in Palestine. And then we conclude the declaration by declaring, and I quote, "The challenge of justice now falls to people of conscience everywhere, to civil society and to social movements, to all of us. As such, our work in the coming months will be dedicated to meeting this challenge. Palestinian lives are at stake. The international moral and legal order is at stake. We must not fail. We will not relent." End of quote. That's the declaration adopted by the Gaza Tribunal that just sets the mission of what will be happening in the coming months.
This is a lot. I actually went through the entire website, and I advise people to take a look. It's an educational journey, actually, to go through the structure, but also the evidence that is being brought to bear and the immense work that's been done for the past months. Can you tell us, Craig, a little bit more about the future implications? Like, can we delve deeper into the future implications, potential future implications regarding this effort, but also, parallel efforts, if you are aware of any at that magnitude, and how they might impinge on the future judgment of the ICJ, even though everybody's looking at the same evidence. But is there a kind of, additional or added value to these efforts in moving the needle in terms of the actual reality on the ground, which, one would think this wouldn't be needed for a court. But can you tell us a little bit maybe about the politics as well?
Well, it is politics, after all, right? I mean, our problem is a political problem. It's a problem that dominant political actors are doing everything they can to make sure that the response to what is happening in Palestine is not a moral response and is not a legal response. I mean, literally so, right? Threatening and sanctioning legal actors at the international system to prevent them from cracking the wall of Israeli impunity that the West has built up so meticulously over so many decades. So it is a political challenge, and the tribunal has a political voice. There are people here who have constituencies, who are visible, who are respected. I'll mention Noura Erakat for Jadaliyya viewers, Raji Sourani, Diana Bhutto, Rajesh Shahada, Ramzi Baroud, Wadia Saeed, Edward Saeed's son, Victor Katan, brilliant lawyer, Sami Al-Arian, Susan Abul Hawa, the Makdisi brothers, right? So lots of other Palestinians.
Nimr Sultani?
And then global figures like Nimr Sultani, global figures like Richard Falk, I mentioned, Penny Green, Michael Link, Cornel West, the philosopher Judith Butler, Mahmoud Mamdani, Tariq Ali, Yanis Varoufakis, Naomi Klein, the brilliant professor, international lawyer, Judge George Abisab, Susan Abul Hawa, Jeremy Corbyn, Vijay Prashad, Halal Alvar, Phyllis Bennis, prominent Israelis like Ilan Pape, Raz Sigal, Jeff Halper, Avi Schleim, right? So all of these people have an audience in in civil society, in the political world as well, and they've all come together around this initiative to amplify this call for justice. Of course, there's the more practical side, which is that the tribunal is putting together an archive of evidence and analysis that will be publicly available, and of course available for legal processes that are that are underway. We are not looking to replace the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, because we are not that kind of mechanism. We're looking to support them, but also to fill a gap that is left by official institutions that are bound by procedures and orthodoxies that are not necessarily adequate to responding in the moment to the horrors that we have been witnessing. It builds on BDS. BDS campaign has been ongoing for many years. It is the centerpiece of global solidarity and global resistance to what's happening in Palestine. And we hope to give it a shot in the arm with this tribunal as well. So hopefully it's complementary. Hopefully it's filling some gaps. Hopefully it's also feeding into those kinds of processes, and that it'll be able to make a contribution in its own right to the struggle for justice. It's Bassam, there is this idea out there that courts, for example, are these sterile mechanical institutions that you feed the law and the facts into one side and justice comes out the other side. In fact, that's not true. It's not true that courts are just, international courts, for example, are just the product of the different states that are the nationalities of the judges. That's certainly not true, but it's also not true that public opinion doesn't affect these courts. It does affect them. And they are all of these institutions are under tremendous pressure behind the scenes in the dark rooms of The Hague and New York and Geneva and elsewhere, under enormous pressure, diplomatic pressure, but also spy agencies threatening and offering inducements and so on. Israel proxy groups calling them anti-Semites and supporters of terrorism. All of those kinds of pressures are mobilized against them to prevent them from doing the right thing. There has to be a more powerful mobilization of people power pushing back for them to do the right thing. And it does affect what happens in those institutions. It affects what happens in some UN bodies. It affects what happens in courts. It affects what happens in public opinion. So anything we can do to magnify the call for justice, to push back against the call for continued impunity and evil that is coming from very powerful actors, not least the government of the United States of America, is, it seems to me, a valuable enterprise. And this Gaza Tribunal is an opportunity to try to make a contribution in that direction as well.
So, you've mentioned, that this tribunal is neither a court, but also seeks to fill a gap in a context where these courts do not operate in a vacuum. Are you, for example, planning to forward your evidence to the ICJ and/or ICC? Are you in contact with governments that are directly involved in the genocide case, for example? Could you give us a bit more detail on the mechanics of how you see this tribunal fitting in with existing legal efforts to challenge Israeli impunity?
Yeah, well, this is an entirely public process. So the archive itself will be published. The analysis, the findings, all of those things are made public
and available to whoever is interested.
Available to whoever's interested. The people who are involved in the tribunal are also part of relevant communities. So we've got a lot of international lawyers who are part of the international legal community and have influence there. We've got others, thinkers and philosophers and professors and teachers and all sorts of other profiles that have, as I say, constituencies that they are a part of and that they help to influence. But the hope is that the tribunal will be catalytic, that it will influence others also to take up these matters. Again, just to repeat something I said, there still is a risk of the level of tolerance that our societies and our institutions have demonstrated for the last couple of years. The level of tolerance for genocide is terrifying. If they can get away with this, they can get away with anything. And guess what? If they can get away with it in Palestine, it won't stop there. So we really think that it's important that we have an organized effort to say loud and clear with voices that have an audience that we will not allow genocide, apartheid, settler colonialism, any of these things to be normalized. That it's not acceptable, and we're going to help to beat the drum and build the pressure that's necessary from our side. I don't think anyone is under any unrealistic expectations that this is going to change things overnight, but this movement for Palestinian liberation has been building for generations, but it's been building at geometrically increased speed over the course of the last 19 months, and we all have to try to find ways to help to build on that further. There are institutions out there that are doing direct legal action, like bringing cases, the Hind Rajab Foundation, Palestine Legal, others that are doing absolutely heroic work that everyone needs to support. Theirs is a separate role from us because they're operating within legal systems and we're operating outside of those legal systems.
But in a sense, in parallel to them.
In parallel, in support of, but also as a means of pressure on those institutions to
and in this context, Craig, if I can interrupt, you stated at the outset that this tribunal takes its inspiration from the Russell Tribunal, and as you know, there have been many others. There was a McBride Commission after the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and so forth. Can you give us an indication about the impact, the success or failure of previous such commissions? What is their value in terms of concrete results, whether in the short or over the longer term?
I mean, I think the most important value is in raising consciousness, is in serving as what we've been calling a jury of conscience, right? In pronouncing on the morality of what we are seeing, that can influence the public debate as well. That there are significant parts of all of our societies that are not as aware and enlightened as those who are very active in human rights movements and so on, and that prominent voices can help to influence that. Nobody would suggest that the Russell Tribunal stopped the Vietnam War, but I don't think anyone would suggest that it was irrelevant to the building of a movement against the Vietnam War. And I think that's where people's tribunals, which is the generic name of these kinds of initiatives, play their most valuable role. They are panels of conscience, but they address the conscience of a broader audience of society at large. And it is hoped that as the Russell Tribunal did that and helped to contribute to the movement against U.S. aggression and atrocities in Vietnam, that the same can be done for the movement to end Israeli atrocities and impunity and complicity of the U.S. and the U.K. and Germany and others that make this, and the media, by the way, media corporations that make these atrocities possible.
Well, Bassam, I have another question, unless you'd like.
No, I wanted to sort of shift gears a little bit, so please go ahead, and then I'll shift gears.
Well, I just wanted to say that it seems that your efforts are directed not only at directly addressing Israeli atrocities and impunity, but also perhaps equally at the participation, at the complicity of foreign governments, and not only foreign governments. Do you think that on that side of the ledger, if you will, a tribunal such as yours can perhaps have a more visible impact in terms of directly addressing the acts of omission and commission of outside actors?
Yeah, I mean, we all know that this genocide, the continued persecution of the Palestinian people, the entire Zionist project could not continue without the complicit of powerful Western states, Western based corporations, I don't want to use the word Western too much because the complicity of countries of the region are
Adds a
equally
globe. Yeah.
right. But in this case, and that's where we're sitting at the moment as well. So Western governments, yes, parts of international institutions as well have been complicit in our view. The corporations, media companies, to be sure, that you cannot, if it weren't for the terrible behavior of most Western media corporations in hiding the genocide, or trying to hide the genocide. As I said, it's live streamed, but in obscuring it for those who get their media from these corporations, in dehumanizing Palestinians, in justifying war crimes, in distorting the narrative, it would be impossible for Western support to be maintained, because it's already weakening with every passing day, because people are seeing what's happening and coming out to risk. Imagine where we would be if it weren't for the complicity of these media corporations. So it is with governments like the US that provide the weapons and the diplomatic cover and the dissemination of propaganda from their podiums, and the intelligence and the money and everything else that it takes to carry out a genocide. So they are complicit. They are a part of the campaign. We want to bring pressure, as the movement is doing, inside countries that are complicit against corporations. By the way, weapons manufacturers are also mentioned. Energy and tech companies are also mentioned. All of these complicit actors to be exposed, to be held to account, is a part of that. A part of that plan. Israel and international institutions are not afraid of Israel. What they're afraid of is the United States and the European Union and the United Kingdom and the media that does the bidding of Israel and bringing pressure to bear on those institutions. And so they have to be exposed. They have to be pulled out of the equation little by little. It's not the same as South Africa, MOUIN, as you and I think have discussed before. But it is true that the US continued, and the UK and others continued to support apartheid in South Africa straight through the 1980s.
Yeah.
And they only were compelled to stop their support for the apartheid regime when civil society made it too difficult for them to continue. Churches and mosques and synagogues and labor unions and social movements and others in an organized anti-apartheid movement made it just untenable for that support to continue. And we don't have all of the advantages of that moment in history, but we have some of them. And that's, I think, what building the movement is all about. The regime has to be isolated. It has to be boycotted and sanctioned and embargoed. It has to be excluded from cooperation in polite society while it is perpetrating this long-term genocide. And all of this, I think, can help to bring that to bear. It has to be removed from the UN, for God's sake. Of course, the US will not allow it to be removed under the Charter because it has a Security Council veto, but it can, as in the case of South Africa, where the US and the UK refused to allow the Security Council to remove South Africa. The General Assembly
suspended from the General Assembly. Yeah.
All their credentials, they couldn't vote, they couldn't participate, any of the subsidiary bodies, and that was extremely powerful. It's long overdue for something like that to happen with the Israeli regime as well.
I think you're muted, Bassam.
I want to talk about the jumping. I think there's been actually a not just a shift. A shift, I think, was happening a while ago, but I think there is almost a flip that is taking place recently, and I want to get to that in a minute. And talk about, the coincidence, because it is coincidence. You guys did not plan this, and the extent to which this can be productive. But before we get there, and I'm glad MOUIN asked about the complicity of outsiders, because I would like to share a tweet that you made Is that all right?
Yeah, tweets are public.
Yeah, no, I know because I didn't check with you before. I apologize. So in this tweet, you talk about the United States complicity specifically. And I know that at some moral, ethical, and add any other words that anyone likes here. I think the biggest culprits are Arab states and their leaders who are sitting by. I mean, this is actually something we don't talk about. A lot of people don't talk about, not because we are giving them a break. It's because we've had zero expectations for decades. And it's not a surprise. It's not a shock, right? So we've dedicated some time to that, and we'll come back to it. But on the question of the U.S. and the question of the tribunal, you helped co-draft, and the question of ICJ's ruling in the future, the U.S. is in a very precarious position if indeed the ICJ rules against Israel in terms of this genocide. So first, let me read the tweet, and then I could.
Are you muted again, Bassam?
Sorry, with the news of ceasefire talks and quotation marks distracting attention from the ongoing genocide across all of Palestine, not only Gaza, because as we know now, I'm adding to the tweet. Just 2 days ago, the state of Israel announced the expansion of settlements to another 22 in the West Bank. In all cases, you continue, please remember that the U.S. is not a mediator. It is a party to the conflict and a co-perpetrator of the genocide, fully dedicated to the destruction of the remnants of Palestine and its people. Set your expectations accordingly. The U.S. government cannot be part of the solution because it's a fundamental part of the problem. So can you talk to us a little bit about, for those of us who are not as steeped in the question of association regarding countries that enable, support genocide, if the ruling is indeed that Israel is committing a genocide anytime in the future. And I know this is going to be quite away from now, but if you can tell us a little bit about that in the context of the U.S. role, which also explains a lot of the oscillations we see, even if they're not consequential. In other words, U.S. talks a big game in terms of only sometimes, in terms of Gazans, people in Gaza starving and so on. But these words are usually inconsequential.
Yeah, well, I mean, the centerpiece of that tweet was that, I find it extremely frustrating. It's something I've been harping on for many, many years now, how media, sometimes international institutions like the UN, will actually go along with this charade of the US as a mediator. And it's another example, really, of the Israel exception. In every other, let's say, conflict situation, crisis situation around the world, there's an insistence that the mediator not be one of the parties to the conflict. It's just fundamental, basic. You don't have to have a degree in conflict resolution to understand that you don't have one of the parties to the conflict playing the role of mediator. And yet they go along with this charade over and over and over again. And then it permeates into the broader society and discussions happening in the media and social media, in other words, where they give legitimacy to this idea of the US as a mediator in its own conflict, in its own crisis, in its own situation of violence. And I think that just needs to really be shut down. The US, complicity is a crime in international law. Complicity in genocide is specifically named as a crime in international law. And it is criminal conduct, not just with regard to genocide, but with regard to war crimes, with regard to crimes against humanity. You don't have to wait for a decision by the ICJ that genocide has taken place to have criminal accountability for US actors, including government actors. Because remember, for these kinds of crimes against humanity and so on, there's no immunity. on the part of these actors. So criminal liability is already evident. There's no question of the criminal liability of people in the Biden administration, people in the Trump administration, people in the UK government, people in the German government. There's no question. And there have been a number of legal actions that have been brought in national courts and complaints submitted to the ICC for accountability for these perpetrators. Joe Biden cases have been brought, cases in the UK, a complaint that went on Angela, what's her name? Van der Leyen, the head of the EU, and so on. So, so there are these, individual activities, but that's the point that needs to be made. And this is the outrage, right? These things are already illegal. These are laws. The violation of these laws is manifest and public. We know that what the U.S. and individuals in the U.S. government and in the UK government and the German government and others, we know what they're doing are violations of international law, and yet there's no enforcement because the international system is dominated by, not by law, but by geopolitics and by politics and by brute force and by just an instinctive deference to power that undercuts the authority of international law. And national systems are oppressive. Governments, the government of the United States is an oppressive government. Government of the UK is an oppressive, German government is an oppressive government. They are literally oppressing their own people for merely standing up to oppose a genocide that's being perpetrated in real time. So these are oppressive governments that are going to defend their own power, and courts have not yet, national courts have not yet displayed the kind of enthusiasm for prosecution of these crimes. But that day will come. I am confident that some of these people will face trial. I'm confident that a larger number of them will be. Sorry, Moin?
I didn't say anything.
Oh, I heard a voice. Must be the NSA. Turn off your microphone, NSA. That some of these people are going to face accountability in criminal accountability. Some of these people are going to face, not that they'll necessarily be convicted, but that there will be cases brought. A larger number will face civil liability for damages, for harms that they have caused. And all of them will face the judgment of the court of public opinion and the judgment of history. And we are, at the very least, trying to contribute to the judgments of public opinion and the judgments of history, in hopes that some of this will also translate as well into legal accountability under the rule of law. So, the crimes are there. There's no question about it. And there are legal initiatives underway to hold these actors accountable. Maybe some of the archive that's being produced by the Gaza Tribunal will assist in those processes. But at the very least, not allowing them to walk around in polite society as if they are worthy of respect, I think is a worthwhile endeavor.
Before we go on and address whatever we would like to close with, I would like to ask you a question, Craig, about the current international atmosphere, where we are seeing a dramatic flip in the positions of so many who have held back and who have continued to either be silent or support the genocide. And we're seeing it not at the level of just, random public figures and media personalities and especially in the new media, where these personalities have exponentially more followers than, traditional media personalities, but also among states like Canada, France, Britain and their spokespersons in various capacities. Can you tell us, based on your experience, and I just found out, and I'm going to out you in public, but not completely. I just found out that you're actually older than me, and I wasn't sure. And this means that I can ask you this question, given your your experience. When do these changes matter? And I am certainly not among those who look at a poll and say, oh, things are actually changing, or look at some of these statistics about positions vis-a-vis the genocide, or statements by important, in quotation mark, leaders and people, and say, oh, things are actually changing concretely. I don't think they are actually. But I know that at some point they matter. Can we get your opinion on when do you think these things matter? Because as like you and I and MOUIN have we were adults in the 80s, and the question of South Africa in parts of the 80s, or the early parts, wasn't a big deal. Towards the end, it was a big deal. In the 1990s, it was, of course, everyone always pretended that they were always against this, just like our guest the other day, Omar
Apartheid
Al-Aqad.
or the genocide against Afrikaners?
Sorry?
People were against apartheid or against the genocide against Afrikaners?
I'm talking about the concept. So yes, when do these things matter? When does this sea change begin to matter in terms of policy? Or in this particular case, given the connection between the US and Israel, and given that Israel has partners, quote unquote, within the United States, has support within the United States, as opposed to South Africa, which actually has very little by way of internal supporters. Let's call them supporters, right? When do these things matter, or will they in this particular case, given what I just shared about the connection between the US and Israel?
Yeah. Well, so since we're all old here, and we do remember earlier movements, we're old enough to remember the movement against the war in Vietnam. We're old enough to remember the anti-apartheid movement. We're old enough to remember.
I have to exit this one. The war against I was actually not as aware as South Africa.
Actually a few years younger than me. I remember the movement against the war in Vietnam. I was a child at the time, but I remember it quite vividly. The civil rights movement. The U.S. was still an apartheid country when I was born, and for several years in my early days, the U.S. was an apartheid country itself. We called it Jim Crow. We didn't call it apartheid, but it was apartheid. It was a system of racial domination, and it was officialized. It was in laws and institutions and elsewhere. And all of those movements, as movements do, they build slowly and slowly and slowly until one day the dam breaks and you get to flow. Now, I do not believe that the pronouncements that have been coming out of official institutions in the West, in Europe and in Canada over the course of the last several days are indications of a sea change. I think they are more likely theatrical, performative pronouncements being made as a fig leaf for 2 years of support for genocide and 77 years of support for apartheid, because publics are starting to resist more and more and more, and it's getting to the point where it's impossible for them to ignore it. But we're not at the South Africa point yet.
Even J.D. Smith has had to change her mind.
Yeah. We're just at the point where they have begun to see we have to say something. They are not at the point where they're saying we have to do something. And, this idea of even Spain, which has gone further than some, the idea of, we are going to do something, or we need to consider doing something, I don't think is anywhere near where we should be. But it is an indication that they are starting to realize. Compare the statements that we're hearing now to the statements that were made, being made 18, 19 months ago, where they were all in for genocide. And you realize that we do have a voice. we do have some power. If we can organize, if we can mobilize, if we can bring that pressure to bear, we can change things. Nothing is going to change the psychology of the Israeli regime in a country where recent revelations have shown that the majority of people want the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and Palestine more broadly, where almost half of all Israelis want the genocide of the Palestinian people, where you have a far-right regime in power that at best would hand over to another Zionist regime that would be equally racist, equally committed to conquest and erasure. But
and both democratically elected, I think it's important to point out, reflecting the political will of the electorate.
Absolutely, yeah. So nothing is going to change that internally anytime soon, despite the absolutely heroic dissent that comes from a tiny fraction of the Israeli public. It is heroic. It has no bearing on the policies, practices, or ideas or ideology of the regime. That's why the declaration we've adopted, it deals squarely with this ideology of Zionism, which is the central challenge here. Either you believe in human rights and equality, or you commit yourself to a colonial supremacist project that is the project of Zionism. But even though we can't change their view of the world in Israel, we can change their material conditions by isolating the regime, by boycott, divestment, sanction, embargoes, by making it socially unacceptable to engage with Israeli cultural institutions or sports teams or universities or to buy from Israeli tech companies. I mean, that is something that can happen outside. The pressure for change is not going to come inside anytime soon. And with all the faults in Israeli society, I think they will allow that project to crumble before they will take an enlightened approach based upon human rights and equality. But the pressure from the outside can make a difference. So, Bassam, your question is, when does the change come? It's building. We have to not get tired. We have to keep filling the bucket until it overflows. And that moment comes, and it comes all at once. But the only way to stop that is for us to quit.
Craig, can I just follow up on that? I'm not taking issue with anything that you've just said, but But I'm curious if you'll also agree with me that there's a difference between dismantling Jim Crow during the 1960s, or dismantling apartheid, or at least generating external pressure for the dismantlement of apartheid, which was primarily a domestic liberation struggle during the 1980s. And that is that in these Western countries, the chasm between ruler and ruled seems to be much larger, or at least significantly larger today than it was a few decades ago. And therefore, the intensity of pressure that needs to be brought upon these governments to change their policies is going to require a lot more work and mobilization than might have been the case, let's say during Vietnam or any of these other cases we've been discussing. Is that something you agree with or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is significantly more difficult at this moment to try to, just say it directly. I live in the United States. The United States is not a democracy. You could argue that it never was. It had some democratic features, but even those have been whittled away in the last 40 years. The US is by definition a plutocracy. It is an oligarchy. It is a country in which there is no relationship, as studies have shown, between, on the one hand, the will of the majority of the people, and on the other hand, the actual focus of policies and laws and institutions of government. And this is one example of many, but perhaps the clearest of all is that the degree of capture and corruption in U.S. institutions of governance around the question of Israel is almost absolute. We have, as you know, corruption in the U.S. is legal. It has been legalized successively by a series of laws and decisions over time. Political corruption is legal here. You can pay for whatever you want. Donald Trump took.
And then you get to write the legislation.
you get to write the legislation. Donald Trump took $100 million from Miriam Edelson, just one Israel lobbyist, in order to do the bidding of an oppressive foreign regime with U.S. levers of U.S. government power. And that's legal in this country. I mean, that would be outrageous to anyone who believed in something like democracy. So it's much harder because the U.S. Congress, the administration, university administration, they don't give a damn about human rights or right and wrong or anything like that. They know where their bread is buttered. The challenge is to make it more difficult for them to comply with what their owners want them to do than what the public wants them to do. And that means we have to build the movement even more stronger and more powerfully than the movement that was built to oppose Jim Crow, or the movement that was built to oppose South African apartheid, or the war in Vietnam. Yeah, I agree with you, MOUIN. It's harder now, but the formula is the same. We just need to do a lot more.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let me just clarify to somebody in the comments that somebody in the comments, MOUIN, was correcting you that there is no genocide against Afrikaners. So yeah, MOUIN was just satirizing the claim by.
But Elon Musk said there is.
It must be true.
Yeah. So I just want to confirm to some of our viewers that MOUIN was just being satirical about the claims by some of our awesome leaders. So
it's absolutely amazing to me. People often characterize the Trump administration as childish, right? And you watch it and you think he really is childish. Those around him are childish. But I never thought that he would be so childish that he would literally bring the president of South Africa to the Oval Office and say, "I'm not committing genocide, you're committing genocide." I mean, it was really such a juvenile display that you just can't believe that they've come to this to this level. But kudos to the South African president for maintaining his composure and not taking the bait.
Craig, and I'm going to ask this of both of you actually, because I'm in the company of the wonderful and great MOUIN Rabbani. Can we just as we close, because we will talk about this further about the tribunal. Do you have any comments on the timing of the announcement to expand the settlements in the West Bank at this moment? And of course, given that Smotrich is in charge of that department, so to speak, is there a connection between what might transpire in the coming week or 2 or 3 or 4 in Gaza and this announcement? If either of you would like to comment on it, since it's fresh and might be connected to a number of things that are taking place. MOUIN, if you want to take that also, please feel free to jump in.
Sure. Craig, after you.
Well, I want to hear what you have to say, MOUIN, too, but I would only say that the Israelis are the masters of distraction and bait and switch. And throughout this entire genocide, they have been playing the distraction game very, very well. They know that Western audiences only have so much bandwidth. And, I think this is this plays into this. But I think, as I tweeted myself today, I think that all of these distractions, the principal focus at this stage is to allow them to implement the final phase of the genocide in Gaza, even as they begin to expedite the application of the genocide in the West Bank. And the last thing I'll say about that is there is no indication, despite these pronouncements by European leaders and others of mild discomfort and rumors about Netanyahu and Trump not getting along, there is zero indication that the Israelis themselves are feeling any reduction in their wall of impunity at all. And you know that by announcements of new settlements in the West Bank. You know that by new ethnic cleansing operations. You know that by attacks on hungry people. There is no sign that they are feeling that their impunity is threatened. They're going full speed ahead in all of these projects. So yeah, is it a coincidence? I don't really believe in coincidences. I think that all of this is very carefully considered. I'll say this one. I want to hear MOUIN's analysis. The shift came with the election of this government, right? You had a period for decades and decades and decades where the West had accepted incremental genocide as, there's at least a tacit agreement. Okay, Israel, do your genocide incrementally. Just let it simmer below the surface, do some displacement, build some settlements. Every once in a while, you can bomb Gaza, but keep it at an incremental level, and we will continue to support you with everything we have. This new government, openly fascist, although there's an argument that every Israeli government is fascistic. Aimé Césaire said that fascism is colonialism brought home. And so a colonial entity, everything they do ultimately, it seems to me, is fascist. But that shift came not in October of 2023, but in January, when that new government immediately took power and instantly started implementing a policy of expedited genocide. My first trouble at the UN was not in October, it was in the spring, when I was calling out genocide beginning to bubble up in this regime based upon, one, the statements of ministers and military officials and others, and two, what they were doing on the West Bank at that time. So yeah, that's what I think. But I'd love to hear MOUIN's analysis.
Well, I think, Craig, you've given one interpretation, which may well be the correct one. I'd like to suggest an alternative one, admittedly speculative, which is that for whatever reason, the Trump administration may be preparing to call time on at least this intensive phase of genocide in the Gaza Strip. Because Israel was given a very long leash, it was given every opportunity to achieve the destruction of Hamas as a military force. It was given every opportunity to starve the Palestinian population out of the Gaza Strip, and it failed. And the failure now is beginning also to make, these constant images of skeletal children and so on are not very good optics in Washington. So it may be the case, I'm speculating, that Washington is preparing to call time on a genocide at this level of intensity. And it may also be the case that the Trump administration is also preparing to recognize a formal Israeli annexation of all or at least parts of the West Bank. And it may also be the case that Netanyahu is compensating for what he sees coming from Washington by expanding further into the West Bank, both because that is what Israel has been doing compulsively since June of 1967, and because it also helps in terms of his personal and coalition political calculations. I'm not one who buys this argument that this is all about Netanyahu remaining in power. That's only part of it, and I would argue not even the main part of it. This is about how Israel would have responded under any government, provided it had been permitted to do so by the United States and Europe. And I think there's one more factor that we often don't take into account. Israel is no longer capable of self-restraint. You pointed out quite correctly. 10 years ago, they would have not even announced the expansion of the establishment of one settlement. They would have presented it as the expansion of an existing settlement. What, you're saying babies can't be born? These tired old arguments they used to put forward. They are no longer capable of self-restraint for the reason that you've been discussing, Craig, for the past hour, which is when you're given impunity for year upon year and decade upon decade, and your sponsors make clear that they're prepared to burn the world down to the ground in order to ensure that you're never held accountable for anything, you lose a capacity for self restraint to do things quietly, to do things under the radar. And I think that's an important part of what's happening as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I have to say, my own feeling about the Gaza piece of it, and I think I've been saying all along, this is not a Gaza genocide; it's a Palestine genocide, and it applies to the West Bank equally. Just that they are adopting different tactics there, obviously. I think that the government of Israel will back off on Gaza when they are convinced that the outcome is inevitable. And the outcome for them has never been about hostages or even about Hamas in the first instance.
It's about forced displacement.
About the destruction of the Palestinian people and about the ethnic cleansing of all of the Gaza Strip. And they know that how genocides work. You don't have to kill everybody, but you have to kill enough people and destroy enough infrastructure and enough of the land. I mean, as you know, what they're doing is not just dropping bombs, but they're going with bulldozers to totally flatten everything to make sure there's nothing to return to. The biggest shock they got was during the last ceasefire when Palestinians beaten and battered got up and walked for kilometers and returned home. And that scared the hell out of the fascists.
It was like southern Lebanon in 2006.
Right. So if they feel that the outcome is inevitable now, that they have done enough damage to the people and to the infrastructure, that people are now compelled to leave or die, they will stop.
Yeah, and if I can just, sorry, go ahead. I interrupted you, please.
I don't believe that they will agree to, they may agree to a short ceasefire if it can be a trick to try to get a hold of a couple of more hostages, whatever the case may be, but they will immediately resume the slaughter at the expiration of that, in my view.
Yeah,
it's certainly true that West Bank is the big prize for them,
that's entirely plausible, but an alternative scenario is, I think Israel by now recognizes that this idea of an orderly, quote unquote, mass expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to the deserts of Sinai is a non-starter. And so what they're looking for is precisely, as you said, to make the Gaza Strip uninhabitable. And then you have more of a Syrian situation where individuals, families, small groups of people leave because they've been forced to leave out of desperation over a prolonged period of time without, being directly pushed out by the government or leaving, in an orderly fashion. And I think, for Israel, which at least until recently has always had patience in achieving its strategic objectives, that may be their game here.
It may be. The last thing I'll say on that is that, this also explains why they invest so much in attacking the UN, UNRWA, and the UN more broadly, because it's the last lifeline that delays them from meeting their objectives there. And this whole Gaza Humanitarian Foundation ruse, this extension of the Israeli occupation and genocide with the humanitarian fig leaf, is for that principal purpose, which is get the UN out of the way so that we can finish the job.
Yeah.
Thanks to both of you. I agree with so much of what you both shared. I do think that in the coming months, I don't mean 6 or 8 months. I mean just the next 2 or 3 months. There will be some sort of a breaking point, not a breaking point that will change everything, but it seems that on the one hand, Israelis are working, killing, so that ultimately there's a break in Gaza in terms of either Palestinians in Gaza turning, quote unquote, whatever that means, turning on Hamas en masse, or an explicit desire ubiquitous desire to just leave because they cannot come back, and that's not happening. Neither is happening at any significant level. So they're continuing, and they have a carte blanche. I don't think the carte blanche is completely open. Call me naive. I don't think it's completely open, not because of humanitarian reasons, but because of other considerations by the United States. Though the timing might be completely arbitrary. And then there's a potential breaking point within Israel, which we don't talk about very much, considering the catastrophe, the calamity that's taking place in Gaza, that under the hands of Israeli bombs, or under Israeli bombs. But it seems that with the way things are moving, especially not the international opinion that's changing, because most of it, in my view, at least at the level of public figures, politicians or otherwise, is changing largely because people want to make sure that they are on the right side of history in retrospect. But inside Israel, if you follow, I follow a lot of the news inside Israel, and we're beginning to experience successive and growing number of meltdowns within Israel regarding everything that's happening. Not that people are feeling bad, but in interviews with Israeli officials, right? If you are noticing, something is actually happening. Like interviews by the same.
For God's sake.
No, sure. No, that was actually, there was no meltdown. Ehud Olmert, called Netanyahu names, called Israel's actions war crimes. Sure, but I'm talking about actual meltdowns between by Israeli officials that are interviewed by the same journalists who 8 months ago or a year ago were basically, on their side, quote unquote. And it's very interesting. It's very interesting that this is happening. It's not an anecdote. It's started happening in November, December, January, February, but now it's actually very recurring, and it does speak of like some sort of a breaking point. And I know that people talk about breaking point. People who talk about breaking point are considered to be naive, but we're not talking about this 2 months in. So it seems that there is a kind of the ground is now more prepared than before for something, maybe not tectonic, but something.
We'll know the tide has turned when the BBC no longer habitually ends every report by repeating Israel's justifications for genocide like a parrot.
But even the BBC, some BBC reporters are causing these, are asking questions that are causing this meltdown, and these are of course like really soft remarks. My remarks are soft in terms of what I'm referring to, but I do think that the carte blanche that we are witnessing is actually not open-ended. And I do also think that what's happening in terms of U.S.-China relations, in terms of the standing of this presidency right now internally, in terms of polls, in terms of the stock market, economic changes, maybe actually a distraction that is serving Israel, right? But there will come a time when I think in the coming couple of months, we will learn more as to the limits of the current Trump administration in terms of this carte blanche that is evident on the ground today. But maybe I'm just hopeful.
Maybe I wouldn't say that we are at a tipping point here, but I would say that we can see the tipping point from here for the first time. That with dynamics inside Israel, their own economic and political travails that we're witnessing, with the building of opposition across Western societies, in particular, with people taking institutional and legal measures and so on, we can see it from here. This is exactly the moment to bring up the pressure. This is exactly the moment for mass mobilizations in civil society to use whatever is at our disposal to bring more and more pressure to bear so that that tipping point will actually engage. And that means, as always, boycott and divestment and sanctions and education and demonstration and disruption and prosecutions and legal cases and everything that we can do to bring that pressure to bear. And we are not yet at our South Africa moment, but I believe we can get there with a sustained movement, and that's what the Gaza Tribunal is all about.
Which is a great segue into closing, because we kept you much longer than we thought. When I spoke with you first, we talked about a shorter one. This was longer, and actually, there's been a lot of interest in more interest in than these other conversations we've been having in this tribunal. So I'm content about this. Craig, is there anything else you'd like to say before we release you? Maybe along the lines of that the question of Palestine is potentially much bigger than the question of Palestine, because this is what this is proving to be. Do you have any parting notes on that?
Look, all I want to say is it's such an honor to be with the two of you, MOUIN and BASSAM. I've learned so much, as I always do in conversation with you, and as I have for years, and I appreciate so much what you do and Jadaliyya does, because I really think that something has happened over the course of the last 2 years. It's not all darkness. There's a lot of darkness, but the light is that people are finding a way to break through the veil of propaganda and the wall of impunity, and independent media and the kind of work that you guys do. That's what makes all the difference. We are educating a whole new generation, a whole new wave in the movement for Palestinian liberation and for human rights and a decent social order more broadly. So just such an honor to be with you both. And thanks for the conversation.
Shukran.
The honor was ours, Craig. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
for making the
Craig,
time
for
to
your
speak with
patience
us.
and your generosity as usual. Thanks, MOUIN. And to everyone else, we will be speaking again. Peace and solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. Salam. Good night. Good afternoon, wherever you're at.
Salam.
Bye.